All right, welcome to the third seminar for the Ecrits. I'm Cadell Last. Today we're hosting Isabel Millar. Isabel Millar is a philosopher, psychoanalytic theorist from London. Her first book is based on her doctoral thesis, The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence. We actually had a conversation about that book on my channel if you're interested in checking that out. I think it was, at least for me, incredibly illuminating. And she is currently writing her next book titled Patipolitics for Bloomsbury Philosophy. And I think in this seminar, we're going to get a little sneak peek into Patipolitics and what that means for her. So that's the introduction, Isabel. The floor is yours, and really welcome to the seminars for the Ecrits.
Thank you, Cadell. Thanks so much for this invitation. And thank you, everyone, for being here. So, as Cadell said, this is my next project that I'm going to be talking about today, and as such, it is work in progress, and it's a I suppose you could almost call it a sequel to the Psychoanalysis of AI. Certainly, the previous book has provided the groundwork theoretically and conceptually and speculatively to the stuff that I will be talking about today. So Patipolitics is, rather than at the moment a sort of particular book from start to finish, I would say it's more like, without sounding too grand about it, it's more like a paradigm that I'm thinking about, that I've been thinking about since the last book, which has grown out of course, the lineage of biopolitics and necropolitics, and was a sort of backdrop to how I began the whole idea of thinking about the psychoanalysis of artificial intelligence as a project. And then that kind of, took a back seat as I went more into thinking about psychoanalysis. So the first of all, terminologies, patio, the Latin to suffer, is of course for the psychoanalytic ear will immediately conjure up the question of enjoyment and the concept of jouissance. And I'm sure people may have heard me talking about this in other places, and or will already be familiar with this notion and the way that I'm thinking about the politics of suffering as a sort of ambivalent question. So of course, if we think about it in terms of genealogy, biopolitics, the politics of the governance of life in the Foucauldian sense, and then necropolitics, the governmentality of death, as Achille Mbembe took it from Foucault and developed it in his own way. And of course, this is neither of those positions are sort of exhaustive, or one doesn't complete the other, but in the same way that I was sort of gesturing to this lineage with Patipolitics, or I've started calling it Patipolitics because everyone else says that, but I initially said Patipolitics, but of course it's up for debate. So this essentially goes like this: life, death, sex. Or we could say the government of life, followed by the government of death, followed by the government of the undead, because essentially what we're dealing with in psychoanalysis a lot of the time is the concept of the undead, or the drive. So after, I suppose, finishing the last book, and I've been talking about artificial intelligence a lot since then for the last couple of years, and all of the sort of concepts that arose from the psychoanalysis of AI, there came to me sort of two poles that I think we can talk about as characteristic of our sort of current zeitgeist, as it were, and that everybody talks about and everyone's concerned with. And I suppose you could call that AI on the one hand, of course, but on the other hand, sex, sexuality, the body, and all of the problems that brings up for human subjects. So in a sense, these two questions are questions to do with knowledge. They're questions to do with the psychoanalytic knowledge, and a type of knowledge that is not completed by scientific endeavors, as it were. They're sort of open questions that you can't answer. So I suppose what I'm interested in with Patipolitics is to take the question of the enjoying body and think about the ways in which this has become a mode of governmentality today, that it's not just simply administering and disciplining bodies, or population statistics, or measuring how we live biologically, or measuring every little part of our biological life, but it's also trying to get at something which is sort of unmeasurable. So I suppose you could say sexuality is unmeasurable and enjoyment is unmeasurable, and it's something that's very difficult to quantify. However, it was obviously a big concern for Foucault, and it was something that he was deeply troubled by, and it didn't really come to a clear sort of conclusion about what happens when you understand sexuality as something which is also completely discursively and epistemically conditioned, and what happens when you remove those restrictions and you supposedly imagine this subject of natural sexuality. Well, of course, for psychoanalysis, we know there is no such thing as natural sexuality. Everything is we only have sexuality by virtue of language, by virtue of discourse. So that's a sort of to give you the sort of conceptual terrain of where the idea comes from, the sort of central concept. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some aspects of it that I'm working on. This, as I say, it's a book which contains very many different sort of in a Deleuzian sense, rhizomatic ideas that go off in different directions, and it's evolving all the time. And of course, another person who's very influential in this project is Baudrillard, and his particular concern with sexuality as an ontological question. And, you know, Baudrillard was, of course, very Lacanian, very influenced by Lacan, but he had his particular way of engaging with psychoanalysis, and sort of he was critical of it for various reasons. But I think that he's deeply psychoanalytic and deeply important to think about Lacanian theory for the 21st century, or what I would call the Patipolitical century. And why? Because I think that he understands sexuality as an ontological problem, and one that is only getting more and more complex as we enter into the age of artificial intelligence and all of the other surrounding questions to do with how we're governing, administering, augmenting, perpetually maximizing the capacities of the body. So he was interested in thinking about how there was a relationship between the sort of onward march of scientific rationality and the Enlightenment, as it were, that sort of was mirrored with our sort of cultural investments and our sexual lives. So that he kind of made this analogy, which I think if anybody's read any of my recent essays on it, you may have seen that I've been talking about that, the question of seduction that Baudrillard is famous for talking about. And for him, seduction is a philosophical concept that is the corollary to obscenity. And obscenity for Baudrillard is not just about sexuality or pornography, but it's also about the obscenity of knowledge and the obscenity of information. And of course, now more than ever, we can really understand what he was getting at with this concept, because we not only do we see the pornography of our current age in sexual terms, but we see how obscene our access to knowledge is and our access to information is, and also how obscene our own lives are for everybody else. Everything is known, everything is public. It's very difficult to be secretive or to have a private realm for a lot of us. And that's not just famous people, but everybody. We all feel like we have sort of an impossibility to hide. So his question of seduction was related to this idea, but more fundamentally was to do with the sort of formalization of the universe, you know, the formalization of genetic information, the formalization of cosmological information, that we could sort of uncover the secrets of the world. And he found this to be something problematic, relating to, not because he was an obscurantist, but he saw that there was a relationship between this sort of administering of human life and the sort of unlocking of the secrets of the universe. So this idea of seduction and obscenity is a sort of another dimension of Patipolitics that I'm sort of layering into the sort of Foucault, Membe, Agamben, even Lacan, Baudrillard cake. And then, of course, we have good old Badiou, who is important and strange to put him in there, because in a sense you'd say, well, how can you have Badiou and Baudrillard as the same, as having anything to say to each other, or even be in the same conceptual realm, since they ostensibly seem to be completely at odds. And my first excuse is say, well, I think it's a very masculine trait to always think that you can only have one thinker, not the other thinker, and that you have to find the complete way of explaining the world via a particular master. And I don't tend to do that. So I do often put counterintuitive people together and see in what ways we can think with them. So, for example, the essay that was Cadell may have shared, the Patapolitical Century, which was sort of, I think, the reading for this talk. You know, that kind of began with thinking about how Badiou tries to think about apportioning periods of time, not according to chronological or historical moments, but he subjectivizes time itself, and wants to understand periods of time as a subjective moment where the century can look back and understand itself coherently, and think about the thoughts that were possible in any given time. And so the idea that you know, the previous century was the century of war for Badiou, quite clearly why he takes us through his ideas about that. But for me, then I was thinking about, well, what is this century? What's our century now? And you can say, well, we've only just begun. How can we know what century is? But actually, of course, we don't have to go by actual cut-off points of decades, because actually this century started quite earlier than the beginning of 2000, because it began with Silicon Valley, essentially. So we're quite far into the century. And I think that this is, you know, it's a very Baudrillardian century. And I think my hunch is that it's a Patipolitical century, in the sense that we are no longer just talking about the administration of human life or even human death, but the administration of enjoyment and the undead. And one, yeah, I like that Millarian century. One important aspect as well that, of course, Foucault was interested in was how death had sort of disappeared from view. Death was a taboo, according to Foucault, that actually, I think he says it in Society Must Be Defended, that, you know, it's no longer sex that's the taboo. It's death. We hide death. Death is nowhere to be seen. We don't want to talk about it. It's not part of civilization anymore, as it was for previous civilizations and cultures that had death as part of, you know, everyday life. It was something that you saw. And now, of course, death has been privatized. So Foucault makes that point about the privatization of death, which is very important, actually, to think about this privatization of death, i.e. the privatization of the reality of the human body, of its lifespan, at the same time as the complete exploration or explosion and the making seen sexual life. So whilst, you know, our sex lives, we're supposed to talk about them, we're supposed to be actively declaiming who we are, what we like, what we don't like, be proud, tell everybody, you know, it's not a taboo anymore, and all of the good things that come with unleashing of sexual repression, of course. But at the same time, this has another effect. It has another effect of changing certain ways of understanding human life and understanding how we apportion our libido. So another person who was interested in death, of course, is Baudrillard, because, you know, he spoke about death a lot. Death was very important for him, and in Symbolic Exchange and Death, and I think in quite a lot of his later work as well, he would talk about how, you know, the people of the future, the clones, because he liked to always imagine the most extreme situations, the clones would be after the luxury of mortality, and it would be something that they would pay for, because actually not knowing death is something extremely terrifying. And actually psychoanalytically, this is a really interesting idea, because the thing that could possibly torment people more than anything is really the idea that your suffering couldn't end, and that you would be left with this perpetual drive, just carries on, and the luxury of mortality exactly carries on forever and ever, and you would be sort of haunted by this horrific situation. And so this takes me back to the sort of beginning of the kernel of Patipolitics, which emerged in the Psychoanalysis of AI in a chapter where I was talking about Kant-Vexard and all of the nice juicy stuff around ethics and jouissance, but also to do with the idea of the undead body of you know, the replicable sex bot being. So, you know, in Westworld you have the sex bot that wakes up every day and can be horrifically raped and whatever, but they'll keep doing it because they can't die. Okay, so this idea that, you know, what happens to human beings when they're in situations where they are exposed to this sort of perpetual form of enjoyment. And of course, these are extreme ideas, and we're not in that situation at the moment, but the fundamental crux of this idea is important because it signals to us something about the logics of how we are governed today. And we only have to look at, of course, pornography and of course sexuality, but the ways that we are sort of enjoined to really take that to its nth degree and make that our sort of prime motivation in life. Everything must revolve around this sort of perpetual chasing of sexual gratification. But also that logic exists in the way that, again, we'll go back to the AI question, that the people who are driving the ideas around artificial intelligence and the future are very much concerned with this idea of the superhuman, the beyond human, the transhuman, of course, and the TESCRAIL bundle that people may have heard of as well, that encompasses all these different approaches, all in different ways share these sort of utopian ideas about the perpetuation of human greatness, which really revolves around very strange, fantastical ideas about a sort of body without what a sort of disembodied thing that can live forever and that can't die. And these are not fringe ideas. They are, you know, very central people in artificial intelligence and its surrounding industries that believe this stuff and find it important to think about. So the idea of the sort of horrific idea that you get in, for example, Black Mirror, of what happens when companies not only have the human biological being that they can do anything to, but they've got this sort of transhuman being that they can perpetually extract from. They can perpetually administer and discipline and make enjoy. What happens when we're in that situation? And I would sort of argue that we're not so far off from those kinds of problems. So yeah, so the book, as I say, it will obviously, it's a deeply psychoanalytic Lacanian book, but it tries to sort of bring in other thinkers as well into this question and think about what, for example, you know, it will not be alien to anyone to think that the trans question is one of the questions of our time, and a question that brings up for us not just sort of political, cultural questions, but it's a historical, technological problem. And I say problem because it's something that is only going to be only going to get more and more complex and more difficult to understand as we become more efficient as a species of changing our bodies and changing our sexualities and morphing into different sort of configurations. So at the moment, I think the problems that we find, the culture war problems, are only just beginning. It's only going to get much more complicated. So I think people need to already get used to the fact that we're going to have to equip ourselves very well to understand how properly to deal with the fact that human beings are going to start changing lots of things about themselves, and it's only going to get more sophisticated and more complex. So we better bloody well understand what's going on here. And at the moment, unfortunately, these arguments fall into very unpleasant and unfortunate traps that sort of focus on the wrong things, in my opinion. So I think I've sort of not nearly spoken. I've nearly spoken for half an hour. So
you do have I would say, because we started 5 minutes late, I'd say 10 minutes more if you want. But if you don't, we can just go into a conversation because there's a lot to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, look, I the only thing I'll add, because I think I'm sure things will come up, is of course another element of this is the Adornian dimension, to do with how we think about the sort of dialectic of enlightenment, and this is a sort of dialectical project in a sense, because I don't really consider that we're going to get to this nth point, this sort of Baudrillardian moment where we cross over into the realms of cloning, etc., etc. But I think he's a very important person to always keep in mind, and to sort of bounce up and down against to these extremes, and then to go back to the Lacanian questions. So I sort of use him as a mediator to avoid any sort of too bombastic questions. So yeah, let's open it up and
Sure. Let's do that. I mean, there's so many ways we can jump into this conversation. Where I kind of want to jump in is actually in reference to having watched Oppenheimer last night. So I'm not gonna ruin any. I mean, it's a historical movie, but there's some interesting themes that come up in that movie that I thought triggered some things in me today when I was reading the Patipolitical Century. Specifically in regards to the 20th century, the way you were talking about the subjectivization of the 20th century with Badiou as a paradigm of war, which oscillated between barbaric and final war. And what Oppenheimer oftentimes was thinking about in that movie was, this question of, will the bomb be the war to end all wars, or will the bomb be the war to bring about perpetual peace? And actually sort of concludes that no, actually, it's going to open up a chain reaction of more war or different types of war, which I thought was interesting. But of course, what he couldn't first see was, and this is, I think, the radical nature of what you're trying to think in regards to the 21st century in Silicon Valley, is he couldn't see this transition into like a Silicon Valley world, like a total technological transformation. And so, what types of, ways should we be thinking about war in the 21st century in regards to, I think, even the transgender question, the body? These are the types of things that I'm trying to think about now. Like, just you reference, the culture wars just beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, well, as somebody just said in the chat, perpetual war, that's exactly how I would put it, and perpetual capture in the sense that, we are just constantly at war in different ways. And for us lucky people who don't actually have to experience real war, but and I suppose that's always to keep in mind, is Membe's sort of corrective of to say, well, yes, it is an age of biopolitics, but there are actually people just living in a state of total war all the time, in other places in the world, in serious states of colonization and oppression, etc., etc. So that's of course happening. But I think what I'm particularly interested in is the sort of the way that we have been we've had our capacity to philosophize taken away as a sort of brought Badiou into this, because he's very good at sort of like understanding epochs and understanding how you know, you have to see things on the long haul to be able to really appreciate what's happening with us at the moment. And I do think that there is this this acceleration of thinking, this acceleration of ideas that's all bound up with, of course, the sort of Silicon Valley ideology, and which is really where most of the sort of our cultural, this is sort of engine room of culture, is this sort of push towards optimization and efficiency and the quickest, the best, the most healthy, the most wonderful. And actually what we need to do is completely slow down and completely sort of go backwards. And so I'm very much in favor of a sort of retroactive look at human beings rather than always looking to the future. Even though something that I always talk about is the future, I actually think we need to look backwards. We need to think about slowing down the ways that we think, because on a very practical level, we are not able to think in a very long form way anymore. Children don't grow up knowing how to read books or even learning how to watch a whole film. It's very difficult for young people to concentrate, just because we're constantly having images flash through our minds all the time. So on that sort of very biopolitical level of how you administer a body to completely change the way that it understands itself and understands its rhythms, that's something that is perpetual. That is a sort of perpetual state of capture that I think is very tangible, very understandable. But there are many ways that this is happening.
There's, again, many thoughts running through my head here. One of the first things is actually, you know, kind of that Zizek meme of now is the time to think, not act, you know, like, which, you know, bringing into this slowing down idea, you know, like don't act. Now it's actually the time to just to think.
Yeah.
And actually someone who's here in the audience, Javier Rivera, has been thinking about the concept of waiting, inspired by Buber, just you know, waiting, not acting, just and cultivating attention in that field of waiting. But you know, also, you know, this idea of Silicon Valley that you bring up as defining the century is not so much, you know, like exact temporal landmarks like 1900 to 2000 or 2000 to 2100, but more like, it reminds me of Eric Hobsbawm's book, The Short 20th Century, where he's talking about basically, you know, World War I to the end of the Cold War being the short 20th century. And in some sense here, you're saying Silicon Valley is a representative of a new century. And you know, again, that reminds me of the Oppenheimer movie, where, you know, Los Alamos and the creation of the atomic bomb was where all of our energy was going during, you know, the middle of the century for that final war. But now it's all going into information technology. Now it's all going into artificial intelligence. And, you know, it seems like, again, our whole notion of the way we conceive war has to change. Like, what I'm going to try and point towards here is the way in which, you know, when World War I started, I think a lot of people thought, oh, it was just going to be like another 19th century war. And they were engaging in sort of behaviors that would point towards, oh, we're going to act as if it's a 19th century war. But the technological landscape had changed so much to the point where it was just a horrific consequence. And so the whole nature of war itself changed. So in regards to Patipolitics, in regards to life, death, undead, how would you start thinking about war in the 21st century, I guess?
Yeah. Well, war is happening on many different fronts, as I say, but you know, the main topic, I think, that Patipolitics, of course, revolves around is sex. And I think that, you know, sex is is sort of a weapon of war, as we know, in the obvious sense. It's a weapon of war, always has been, literally, but the idea of sex is a weapon of war at the moment, and it's one which is being wielded in many ways. And you would almost think that it's it was some PR idea of somebody, some very cynical person to come up with the problems that we're having now with all the culture wars, of how to completely divide people along all the wrong lines. So I don't think it would be exaggeration to say that we are definitely in a sort of form of sexual war, but not in the way that the old way that we used to talk about it, of the war of the sexes, men against women, and that sort of naff idea. But I do think that it's a very, because it's such a complicated and difficult concept to understand. It's one which is very easily manipulable, and I do think that, of course, Foucault was interested in the body, the sexual body, and the way that it's sort of used as a sort of tool of science to bring about different ideas about sexuality and repression. But I don't think that well, that's the wrong way to put it, but I think that we also need to think about psychoanalysis as a way of better understanding the stakes of the sexual body, and what are the different issues that we need to start understanding in relation to the sexual body, because they're not the same problems that we were having 30 or 40 years ago. They're already different problems. And for psychoanalysis, the way that the sexual body expresses itself is intimately connected to psychic structure, and the way that we are subjects in the world. And this is, of course, related to language, and of course related to all of our definitions of so-called sanity and madness, and all of the sort of Foucauldian ideas of madness as well. But we really need to understand how we can't make this clear distinction between sex as this thing that we do and is a sort of supposed healthy part of life, and sex as a very important philosophical problem that we haven't really dealt with very well. Of course we never can, because we're human beings, and that's our problem. But I suppose the Patipolitical really at its heart is interested in this very insoluble problem.
Yeah, and it does seem like an insoluble problem. I think, in regards to sexuality being the central dimension of Patipolitics, and the sort of triad you're proposing of life, death, and sex, I kind of want to make a connection here. Is life here under a regime of reproduction of the body, and then moving to sort of death, with Silicon Valley kind of obfuscating death for like the immortal non-body, or like the thing which is going to reproduce itself forever? How do you think the question of reproduction figures in regards to sexuality in a Patipolitical way of thinking? And specifically, I'm thinking about potential culture wars on the question of pro or anti-natalism.
Yeah, this is a big question. Well, as we sort of go much closer to the idea that the reproduction of the species is something completely separate from sexuality, different questions obviously emerge. But and of course, when you have this clear distinction between a man and a woman having sex and producing a baby, and actually what sexuality is, and when we're in this era where it's very clear that these two things are not the same thing, or are never really actually the same thing, that's when you get the sort of upsurgence of people trying to put them together again, or and therefore you get more conservatism, more fundamentalism, more retreating back to traditional values, etc., etc. And so I think we're going to definitely experience that. We are seeing that. We're seeing the rise of the sort of the whole trad wife thing that's coming in. And of course, all over the world, these sorts of upsurgencies of extremism to do with homophobia and transphobia and et cetera, are happening in different places. And, you know, homophobia being, homosexuality being outlawed, for example, in Uganda recently. You know, so clearly these problems come back to the surface the more the knowledge we have about the fact that these two things are separate. And it's a very problematic thing for human beings to try and understand how to get those two things back into step with each other. And so when it comes to the question of reproduction, actual reproduction, I mean, I think we're only just at the tip of the iceberg, really, when in terms of, you know, so the use of sort of synthetic wombs and surrogacy, and of course there's lots of scholars working on that question, but it's definitely one that's going to complicate matters further.
Yeah, I think to me it's just such a huge knot for thought. Like, and even I think, you know, I've sent you a paper. The first paper I ever wrote was on the hypothetical end of biological reproduction. And I just sort of read that. I mean, I was just basically motivated by, you know, or influenced by having read a lot about evolutionary theory, and sort of seeing and then looking at the human species and seeing that our reproduction rate drops below replacement level when we're in material abundance, which is evolutionarily paradoxical. And I think that it's interesting also to see, you know, as you say, this upsurge of more conservatism, fundamentalism, and at the same time, I see an opportunity for the Patipolitical potentially to be almost like a leftist response to the conservative fundamentalist reactionism. Is there anything there? Is there, and if so, could you tease out any threads that might be interesting to follow in that direction?
Well, essentially, what I suppose the book is interested in is examining all of the ways that these things are everywhere all at once. You know, they're all around us. We are experiencing the Patipolitical in every element of our life, and it's more of a question of I'm trying to put my finger on something that is already here, as opposed to inventing something that doesn't exist yet. I'm trying to give a vocabulary for us to understand this very particular conjunction of things that are happening in the last few decades that are related to our relationship to our bodies, our relationship to sexuality, and the technological conjunction of forces, economic, social, political, and how all of those things conspire to make our everyday lives function in a certain way, so that we have to start seeing every little thing that happens around us as Patipolitical. You know, I like Andrew Flores, he said yesterday about how the release of Barbie and Oppenheimer is very Patipolitical at the same time in the same week, and I think that's perfect. That's a great way of articulating it, you know, to be able to see how these different discourses function, that things that may seem completely disparate are actually related. I haven't seen either of the films, but from what I'm going on is that you know, the sort of mundanity of thinking about the glitzy, glamorous idea of female sexuality and the way that femininity is posited in that film, and the problematics between the Ken character and the Barbie character. Again, I haven't seen it, so I can't say too much about it, but I do want to write something about it when I've seen it. And then, you know, you have this great figure of Oppenheimer, who is the supposed emblem of this extreme moment where humanity had to make a decision between saving, the world, or did what he discovered save the world or not save, so this positing of this human one man as being in such a powerful moment as to completely change the whole of human history. And men are always put in this position of being the one man who can change the whole of human history. And so to have Barbie, on the other hand, going into the human world and experiencing an existential crisis, moving from the sort of fantasy woman of the one woman, because she is the one woman. If there is any one woman, it's Barbie, just like Monroe, just like, the bombshell. She is the one woman that doesn't really exist, of course, because she's a doll. But insofar as there is an idea of the woman, she is it. So it's quite interesting to see how that woman and that man exemplify quite very obvious patipolitical questions around the question of the sexual figure of masculinity, the sexual figure of femininity, and what they mean for us, what they mean in terms of how we implicate ourselves according to these ideas. And for the man to be the thing that makes it so that we either exist or we don't exist is quite a particular logic. But yet you have the feminine, on the other hand, as something which experiences her own, who questions her own subjectivity in this hysterical way. Again, I haven't seen either of the films, but
I think Zizek has some points about like all of the things he makes cultural commentaries on. He actually hasn't read or watched. He just he just makes the comment. I don't need to watch it, or but I think that and this is from your article, but it's directly connected to what you were just saying about Oppenheimer and Barbie as these representatives of masculine and feminine logic in interesting ways. Is there's this like quite striking aspect of your article, the Patipolitical Century, where you talk about the Enlightenment search for complete knowledge as analogous to the pornographic drive for an extreme close-up of bodily penetration. And it's like Oppenheimer is here like as this like master physicist and also master theoretician, also has this sort of, drive for the complete knowledge of the atom or something like that, which precisely leads to death in some sense, right? Leads to destruction.
Yeah.
And then, you say, like almost the failure of this Enlightenment paradigm being somehow related to, and you also say, like, for example, the Baudrillardian obscenity of knowledge itself, somehow related to the impossibility of feminine knowledge or the outside of science. And so how do you, I think you pointed towards it already, but maybe you could expand a little bit about, this, on the one hand, the obscenity of masculine knowledge, complete knowledge leading to death. And on the other hand, the impossibility of feminine knowledge and, the Patipolitical, which is sort of just describing what's going on now.
Yeah. So I think this idea of the sort of total knowledge, the total explosion of information and unveiling is this particular obscene masculine drive. And the idea of the sort of the seduction away from the total knowledge is something which I'm sort of interested as well in relation to the idea of femininity as something which has now become a sort of object of science as well, in the sense of the sort of optimization of femininity. Of course, the physical aspect of being a woman, the imaginary aspect of being a woman, is something which at the moment is so peak, intensity that you can't escape the image of beautiful women everywhere, and the perfect beautiful face and the perfect beautiful body is everywhere. And yet it's very strange, because the more we are exposed to these beautiful images, the more sort of uncanny and strange they become. And I'm sure people will have experienced that thing of seeing image after image on Instagram, for example, of beautiful girls, and a lot of them look the same, and the sort of the replication of features that are sort of supposedly sort of the scientific idea of the optimal face and the exact shape of the lip and the nose, but yet they all have similar features about them. They're all quite simulacrum, exactly. They all sort of merge into the same person. And this is not to be sort of judgmental about people wanting to change their bodies and do anything with their bodies that they should, and I think anyone should be able to do that, but we can't ignore the conceptual idea that there is something that happens between the idea of contingency, the sort of contingency of feminine beauty supposedly is this strange configuration of things that happen, and the sort of augmentation and the sort of scientific orchestration of feminine beauty, which we now have. And that sort of does something interesting with the question of the sublime, because if you go back to sort of traditional old frosty philosophical ideas of the sublime and beauty, what would Kant say about the Instagram face? Do you know what I mean? Like, what does that conjure in that sort of romantic idea of of the perfect ideal beautiful face? And that makes me think of course the notion of faciality, which I talk about in the essay on the bombshell, which is part of Patipolitics. It will be part of Patipolitics. The notion of faciality as elaborated by Deleuze and Guattari, and this idea of the face as this sort of semiotic system which combines the white wall and the black hole as two sort of logical parts of the face. And they relate this back to the original face of Christ as the sort of beginning of capitalism and the beginning of the idea of the sort of patriarchal whiteness of beauty, and sort of extract from there a whole sort of semiotic system that is deeply sort of troubling and oppressive, and they ultimately want to go to this sort of probe face, erasure of the face, escaping the face type thing, which is quite difficult to imagine in practical terms. But what they're essentially talking about is the fact that it's not just a question of, okay, there's racism and there's different racism, we oppress some people. He said they're like, no, the original racism starts from the idea of the original face being the white face of Christ that we imaginarily have, and then judge every other face in relation to that original white face, and that everybody is deemed to be more or less lacking in comparison to that. So this original sort of fascistic idea, they sort of think of it in logical terms. So I think this is quite an interesting way to also think about Instagram face, to think about how we administer the face as a sort of tool of sort of fascist ideas as well.
It's fascinating. There's a few things coming up, but one of the things I had a conversation with Todd McGowan on his book, The Racist Fantasy. And I brought up a point that he seemed to appreciate, is like, this is sort of related to the idea you're trying to share here from Deleuze and Guattari about Christ as the original face, or the white face being the norm face. Is like, in science, there was these Voyager satellites which were sent out into space, and they had golden discs on them. And you can look this up, that there's golden discs, and the golden disc contains all the important information on Earth, of course, coming from NASA, coming from culturally, certain cultural viewpoint. It was aiming for universal knowledge. And the idea is kind of like, it's an interesting psychoanalytic question, even, like, because we're sending information out to the hypothetical alien other that would find these spaceships and be able to locate our position in space from this. But the interesting thing is, on the discs, they have two human figures. There's a man and a woman. So they represent sexual difference. Mm. But the forms of the bodies are clearly Euro. Mm. Like, they're European. In other words, I'm just saying this way in which European, even science, universal science, is normalizing a certain form. Mm-hmm. And then there's one more thing I wanted to say, and then maybe pass it back to you for a final question before opening it up to Q&A. I was reading I was reading the Écrits today, and Lacan was talking about how within the first 10 days of life, the baby is overwhelmed by the identification with the face before the body. And that seemed to me to be striking in regards to this metaphor that Deleuze is bringing up with the white hole and the black hole.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because on the one hand, it's like the face is a black hole because you don't know what's behind the face, I guess. It's like this event horizon to the other, but it's also like a white hole because it's like, you know, it's both at the same time in an interesting way. And I just would be interested in what that strikes in your mind. But it's a great idea you're bringing up here.
Yeah, it's the white wall. It's a wall. It's a so it's a sort of the different modes of signification of how they sort of hit the body, I suppose, is interesting to think about. Like, and the face is of course such a fascinating object and psychoanalytic concept, because it is of course the first thing that we engage with, and it's our sort of template for our entrance into the world. And you know, we have a particular part of our brain that is particularly susceptible to reading faces, and of course that can go. And when some people have brain damage, that means that they suddenly lose this capacity to recognize faces. But actually we can always see faces in everything. You know, you see leaves in a tree and you discern a face, and then you can't not see the face. And this strange sort of configuration of elements is something that I'm really interested in as well, in terms of how to take those elements as logical elements and sort of transfigure them into sort of beyond the human form, which is a sort of quite Deleuze-Guattarian idea, really, to sort of take drives or logics of the body and try and perceive them elsewhere, perceive them in sort of non-human forms. So I think like concepts such as, obviously Lacanian concepts such as real, imaginary, symbolic are very useful to thinking about how you can sort of separate elements of the face and of the drives even, and take them elsewhere. So I was thinking about the scopic drive as well, because when you were talking about the masculine logic of exposure and obscenity, this is of course very related to the scopic drive, and something which is quite a masculine element of sexuality is of course the scopic, which is the drive that we are all very, very, very much influenced by at the moment, because all we ever do is look at images. I'm going to shut up now because people want to ask questions.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah. Okay. So everyone, yeah, we're going to open it up to Q&A now. There's lots of questions. We should be able to get to all of them. We'll have a Q&A until the top of the hour. And Joe, you were first to the punch, so just unmute yourself and welcome.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Professor Millar. So couple of things. The term artificial intelligence begs the question whether there is such a thing as natural intelligence. I gather that might be feminine intelligence from some of the things that you've said. And how do we evoke that? How do we live with it in an age of AI? I have another one, but that's enough for now.
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, so you know, obviously the book I wrote before was about AI and kind of tried to grapple with some of those questions, and that's a really interesting way of putting it. Whether there is a such a thing as natural intelligence. I mean, I would immediately off the cuff say no, because I think that there's no such thing as natural anything in a sense. In the sense that natural, for human beings, our intelligence is always mediated through language. I mean, another way to put that would be to draw the distinction between intelligence and sentience. And I think, you know, we talk about sentience as being is this something that AI can have? And I say, well, you can't have sentience unless you have a body, and a body in language. And that's the sort of paradoxical move that you have to make to understand the sort of conjunction of a so-called biological living being that then gets trapped in an artificial system, a dead system of language. And only through this mediation do you then get sentience in any way that's meaningful for us, as talking about intelligence. But of course, it's not as simple as to say, you know, language is just this thing on its own, because language and when they come together, language and human bodies are quite different from language as a dead structure that exists separately in books. And you know, intelligence as a concept is one that has many different facets to it, but essentially intelligence is quite replicable as an inhuman form, and there are many ways that we're seeing that this is certainly something that can happen if you think of intelligence as merely a formal system. And of course, if it's merely a formal system, then yes, there are ways you can augment intelligence artificially. Yeah.
Did you want to follow up there, Joe, just quickly?
Yeah, please. It's not exactly related, but I always feel uncomfortable as a poet when I hear that language is you know, that we can't have sexuality without language is something that you said at the very beginning. And I know this is a very Lacanian idea, but I'm always interested in language, not as discourse, but as metaphor. And I think that this might lead us to perhaps more feminine, quote unquote, natural intelligence. Thanks.
But would you not say that metaphor is a product of language? I mean, I struggle to see how, I mean, discourse and metaphor are different, yes, but metaphor is mediated through language, surely. I mean, I don't think animals have metaphors, in the sense that the sign is what happens when you separate the thing that stands in for the thing, and you can only have a thing that stands in for a thing when you have a sign, which means that something else is dead. So in a sense, language is just merely the ability to abstract meaning and sort of replicate it beyond the living being. So in that sense, I think that rather than saying, you know, you can't have sex without language, I mean, you can have it without speech, you can have it without words, but you can't have sexuality without the mediation of symbols, I think is what I would say.
Joe, if you want to jump back in, we'll get around to you again, because I know you had another question, but we'll go to Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. And thank you, Joe, for your questions. Mine connect to yours, at least I think they do. I'm very interested in what kinds of intellectual and moral resources might exist to slow things down and how they are related to Patipolitics. And in particular, I'm interested in indigenous ontologies. And I can't claim to know much about them, but there's a wonderful little book by a Yupik elder named Harold Napoleon called The Way of the Human Being, in which he references a traditional belief in spirits putting on the flesh of a bear or of a beaver or of a human being. And so we have a disembodied intelligence in another world, in another realm, that comes into this realm and has to be embodied in order to have its capacity to communicate and to make meanings. And I don't know what he would say about male and female, and whether you're putting on male flesh or female flesh or whatever your relationship is to your gendered identity. But it seems like there might be room there for thinking about what ontological resources can be drawn upon for slowing things down.
That's really nice. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, God, I like the idea of returning to those knowledges. Absolutely. My sort of fear, however, is that it's quite difficult to instigate these type of thing. You know, we can kind of in our reified groups think and talk about those ideas of returning to certain different epistemic categories, but how do we actually do that practically when we're sort of immersed in this perpetual capture? And I don't know. I mean, I don't propose to sort of have a program of how to resist, actually. All I suppose I can say is that exactly like you say, returning to other forms of knowledge and returning to the slower ways of taking in information. And, you know, as banal as not using the internet all the time, or as banal as not being on your phone all the time, you know, these are very simple, stupid, practical things. But, you know, when it comes to young people and young minds and all that holier than thou stuff of how to have happy children, I definitely think that it wouldn't be conservative or reactionary to say that young people should not always be interacting with screens when they're small babies, for example. And I don't think it would be reactionary to say children shouldn't look at pornography, for example. Those sorts of things. But again, this is not my, you know, wheelhouse. I don't write to tell people what to do or to how to make the world better or anything like that. But I do think that as a practical thing, those are obvious ways that we are quite afflicted at the moment. Yeah.
Stephen, did you want to respond to that at all?
I suppose it's vain on my part, but I'll put in a plug for my book, Arguments Over Genocide, The War of Words Over Cherokee Removal in the Congress and the Supreme Court, in which I try and do this sort of slowing down by showing ourselves the view from the shore as opposed to the view from the ship. Mm-hmm. And when we see that contrast, we see how much we have lost and how much we have caused in the way of suffering for others.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate that. Thanks, Stephen.
Catherine?
Hi, Isabel.
Hi.
Such a great talk, so interesting. I want to ask really broadly about the role of the imaginary in Patipolitics. Specifically, what I'm thinking about, a few years ago, Lorenzo Chiesa gave an interesting lecture where he talked about modernity as the rise of the superego, or at least the rise of the superego in modernity. And I mean, it seems to me that like the way to like solidify that argument, right, is that in modernity we see the rise of like the symbolic, right, like legalistic regimes and yeah, sort of like let's say like language broadly in a sense, right, like contracts like becoming a thing. And then in the 20th century, 21st century, we see this rise of the image, right, politically. And so I'm wondering for you, like how the image plays a role in Patipolitics and sexuality. And likewise, I mean, there's this interesting tendency as well, like in philosophy in the last late 20th century onward, to talk about incompletion, right? And this seems to me to also relate to the rise of the image insofar as, like, politically, if we have a rise of the image, we're talking about the rise of seeing ourselves as like whole figures, right? Like this sort of false sense of completion, right? And then in philosophy, we have right, you know, like Lacan's Patu, we have Badiou's discussions of incompletion, like what Lorenzo's doing right now with like the not all. And so there just seems to be this interesting kind of like philosophical reaction to the image. I'm trying to like make a connection here. I don't know if you buy it. But I wonder, I mean, just like in this Lacanian register, the imaginary is often like, so like we don't talk about it as much as we talk about the symbolic and the real. Mm-hmm. And so how do you see the imaginary playing a role in your framework? And I hope that makes sense. There's a lot of like different thoughts. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Well, I think that's really interesting question and lots of interesting points that you're bringing to the fore. I would, I suppose, start by saying that I definitely think that we are very much in the sort of era of the imaginary, very much over investment in the imaginary, and it dominates over and above the other registers, but also the scopic drive, again, specifically, not just the imaginary, because of course the imaginary is not just actually seeing but the scopic drive is particularly to do with the visual. But the scopic is, of course, the pornographic drive. The scopic is the ability to perpetually watch, and also, of course, to be watched. But I think that what's particular about the scopic drive, which we could perhaps extract from this sort of imaginary sort of domain of the domination of the imaginary, what's particular about it, what's interesting about it, is I think its capacity to very much divorce you from the immediacy of the body in a strange way, in the sense that you can be a peeping Tom forever. You know, you can always sort of be separated from what you're witnessing. And so you sort of get this enactment all the time of a sort of the sort of grammatical structure of the drive, you know, sort of watching oneself being watched all the time. So this sort of stimulation of that fundamental fantasy, I suppose, is going on a lot at the moment in the sort of imaginarization of everything. It's putting us in this quite shielded position where we're quite cut off from the other sort of more immediate ways of relating to our body, like, for example, the invocatory. I mean, I think that we're less listening, if you know what I mean. Like, we watch all the time, and yes, of course, we are talking to each other, but we definitely speak to each other less. And you could, you know, I'm sure there's lots of adorning arguments to make about the type of music that we listen to, the type of words that we hear all the time through popular culture, and the way that the invocatory functions for us at the moment. So there's definitely something going on here with the imaginary. And of course, on the level of female subjectivation, the imaginary is so dominant and so pervasive in the way that we are understanding ourselves as sexual beings, and of course in the sort of all of the culture wars over what constitutes femininity as well. And yeah, I mean, it's a massive question, but I hope I've sort of touched upon some of the things that you were getting at.
Did you want to respond, Catherine?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, it's such a huge question, right? But there is such a distinctly like feminine like inflection here as well. I was talking to a friend who's an analyst who says that they have a theory. I don't know the theory, like the points of it, but he was saying my theory is that only like people that are symbolically interpolated as women like can actually dissociate, right? And like have that like out of body experience. It's almost like Descartes' ghost is back to haunt us, right? Like all the mind body problem is just like coming back with a vengeance. But yeah, I mean, it's such a huge question, but yeah, thanks for speaking on different points of it. It's really interesting to hear how you're plugging it in different ways. So thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Big Sig?
Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fortunately, I'm not at my usual setup, so I apologize for the background noise from the city. But first off, really great discussion, Isabel. Really, really happy to hear more about the Patipolitics side and your expansion on it. One of the sort of, maybe it's a question, it's more of just like maybe just you could riff off of this, because in your article, the Patipolitical Century, you point out this interesting thing that the idea of woman and the woman's body is always seen metonymically, I can't even speak, metonymically, pretty much, like it's always seen in parts. And the sort of relation between that and obscenity has this mirror relation where at once we always see the pornographic image, whether in actual pornography or even in horror or films, of like the excessive obscenity of just part of a woman's body, a graphic, gory visual image, and its relation to science trying to create a sort of formalization of it. And it seems to me like, and going off of the last person's question for you, this insistence of the superego onto like the imaginary, because there's like a sort of gap within the symbolic, and we get this like sort of perverse obsession of enjoyment on the level of science. Like Lacan says in Seminar 17 that the discourse of science is very much has like a master to it, where it says no more tomorrow, no more. And like it seems that's what science is doing in this sort of phallic jouissance sense, trying to find what a woman is. But it's like the vanishing meteor itself is the subject of science because it needs a body. You can see is like God is lacking because he doesn't have a body, where I think science is lacking because it doesn't have a body. And it sort of tries to do this metonymical thing for the idea of feminine jouissance or feminine sexuality in this sense, but in the sort of imaginary maternal phallic thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, definitely makes sense. I think I understand you. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sort of urge to find out what is feminine in a woman's body, or what is a woman, that we obviously have as a cultural touchstone at the moment, but is a question in every horror film that you ever see. In a sense, you know, the fascination with the female body and dismembering and cutting up and all the horrific things that happen to female bodies. Why do they always happen to female bodies? I mean, it's not just about sex. Clearly there's something sort of conceptual going on there, to do with knowledge, to do with trying to find something or trying to illuminate something that you can't possibly get at. So this sort of urge to uncover femininity is structural. It's psychoanalysis knows that, you know, and films demonstrate that for us, but psychoanalysis already knew this from a long time ago. What is a woman is a fundamental structure of human subjectivity, to ask that question, and it's a question that doesn't have an answer, and that's the point. You know, just like you have the question, what is a woman, you have the question, am I dead or alive, for the obsessional, which is, you can say, is the masculine, the Oppenheimer question, you know. And these two questions are poles of sort of epistemic poles that sort of characterize the century, and they characterize human existence, of course, but particularly when we think about the sort of drive, the sort of epistemic drive of knowledge, of scientific knowledge and of sexual knowledge, they revolve around sort of trying to get to the bottom of this question. And, you know, of course, the Sardian problem was one of really how to sort of count all the different ways that you can enjoy a body, and to audit it in a sense. You know, it's very much about getting to every possible last piece of information you can about that particular form of enjoyment or body. So there's this but very sadistic, you know, obscene obsession with knowledge, essentially. Yeah.
Any follow-up there?
Yeah. I thought that was like really good what you were saying, and I think it's really interesting to think about not only science but also like the subject of science that like Lacan is focused on, because I think like it goes back to what you were saying, Isabel, about the Sardian notion of like how you could enjoy a body and the different things you could do, and it's like science itself lacks. And I think what makes psychoanalysis interesting as a discourse, and I'm tying in with also Marxism, like Louis Althusser points out, and I think Patipolitics elaborates in her What is Sex, is that like we're not seeing it from a neutral position that science tries to say it's doing. Rather, like it looks at, you know, the antagonism of sexual relation, the non-rapport, and even class struggle from within the antagonism itself, rather from this neutral ground. It's like, whether we talk about, you know, a science bro, or like, you know, your random normie, or like the political climate today, it's like we always want to see things from this sort of neutral lens. And I came up with this funny thing with Nick. You have the subject of enunciation and the enunciated subject, right? But I think of it now because of this insistence on remaining neutral and getting all the facts. You got the subject of renunciation. And enunciating yourself, you renunciate from the position that you're actually, mediated by. And so like we could see that happening, but in a sense, like in this insistence, we create more of this sort of perversion and obscenity with science and making things so obscene and grotesque or whatever. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, great points. Yeah.
Javier.
Hi, Isabel. I really enjoyed your talk today.
Thank you.
So there's some things that you kind of brushed on that have been my kind of object of thought lately. Salvational fantasies. For me, it seems like in this era, I mean, I think we can even go further back, but I don't think people really have an understanding about the fact that even if we have salvation, there is no epistemological salvation. And what this reveals, in my opinion, is that you perhaps wouldn't even know if you're in salvation. And so it seems to me like the product with sexuality, it seems like sexuality and this concern of liberation seems to have become like a sort of product of a kind of salvation fantasy, but a salvation fantasy that is simply an orgasm. Like it seems like the idea that we can reach complete knowledge is this salvation fantasy. But to me, it's simply the mechanism of like orgasm. Like, yes, I'm finally gonna get there.
Yeah.
And then we don't realize that when we get there, we don't know what to do with after the sex.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's why it's always disguised as death. And I think even the apocalyptic fantasies are the same. They're salvational fantasies, really. So whether we have a Barbie fantasy, kind of elated paradise kind of thing, or a more apocalyptic, maybe even Oppenheimer, I'm just curious, how can we kind of think through this notion of sexuality and epistemological failure, really? Because I feel like, I feel like we have a kind of, we're pinpointing this down, but I feel like really society has no idea what they're really aiming for when they talk about liberation and salvation. It's like but it doesn't guarantee epistemological salvation. So yeah, I'm just curious about how can we think through this epistemological failure in sexuality.
I think that's a really great way of putting it. And liberation and sexuation are two sort of problems in psychoanalysis that don't really have an answer. And yet they always seem to be connected to each other. And, this sort of the eschatological idea of reaching a certain point of the beyond is quite sort of orgasmic in a sense. It's sort of building up to this one great moment. But of course, what happens after the orgy? What happens when you get there? I was talking the other day about this essay that I recently wrote. I think Andrew was there, but it's very pertinent to what you're saying. It's based on a William Burroughs story called The Popling. I don't know if anyone's read it, but it's quite a little heard story. But it's basically this short story about two little boys who go searching in the sort of northern Canadian woods for this strange creature called the Popling in there, and they go to stay in their father's cabin. And it's a very horrible, creepy story, which begins with autoerotic asphyxiation and carries on to talking about how these little boys search for this strange creature, which is like a fish, but it's not a fish. It's this weird river-dwelling creature, which is basically the shape, a sort of tall, translucent creature, which is essentially like a sort of walking phallus. And it's a sort of human being that's sort of taken over the form of a phallus and basically is a walking orgasm machine. And they basically find it and they trap it and they take it back to their house and, as you can imagine, do things with it. I mean, yeah, it's a very, very gruesome story, but why it's interesting is that it's it's about the psychoanalytic idea of the total body, the fantasy of the total body, the completion of a body that can just incorporate all of its senses at once and sort of respond immediately to its environment. So, you know, in the story, it talks about how the popling can look from any part of its body, so it can look at you with its arse, right? And so they have this like interaction with each other where they're like completely erotically charged with this strange connection. And ultimately the story ends them talking about, well, but what happens if you fuck the popling? And he's like, well, he won't let you, because, you know, it can be very dangerous. And he's like, okay, but and what if the popling fucks me? And he's like, well, you'll find out soon enough. So by the end of the story, you're like, oh shit, someone's getting fucked by the popling. And, you know, it's this very horrible story, but at the same time, it's got this sort of childlike masturbatory fascination, young teenage boys being obsessed with their penises and stuff. But it kind of articulates this very psychoanalytic idea of trying to get to the bottom of what an orgasm is and how it relates to the nuclear family, the idea of family enjoyment. You know, they're in their father's cabin. You know, there's all these weird tropes around it. But also, I thought it was really interesting because it made me think of all of the sort of AI discourse around the ultimate sexual body, the ultimate sexual fantasy, the day when we reach a point where we can have the best orgasms ever, which is something that these sort of tech people talk about. So this idea of the total body, this fantasy of one that can't actually exist, but yet it's this logical placeholder. I think Burroughs really like puts his finger on what's actually going on there, the weirdness of it when you actually put it into language. This is what you get, this strange object.
You want to respond to that, Javier? All good? Chetan?
Thanks for a wonderful talk. Actually, I've got a sort of not exactly a question, but a sort of confused state, which I think you can say something on. So as I see, I think there are three developments taking place, which I think are interconnected with each other. One being this technological AI thing coming to the sphere. The other thing being that our politics is getting more and more smeared with jouissance. You know, if you look at the political rallies of these authoritarian leaders, you'll immediately see that earlier they had to invoke certain community, traditions and so on and so forth, which were then connected to jouissance. Now these leaders can directly invoke jouissance into those rallies. Now those speeches have become a way of certain modes of enjoyment, which although is linked to a certain community, but doesn't necessarily directly invoke the community. It directly invokes the pleasure or a certain kind of enjoyment, derived from being part of certain mob-like structures. And I think I'm seeing this more and more in India. I think Trump was an interesting figure there to think about, that. And I think that is what I think, Patipolitics in that sense is doing. And I think these two things are in some ways linked. The other, I think, is this question of aesthetic governmentality. I think there's a very wonderful book by Asher Gertner, where he sort of gives a brilliant example that, today you don't need statistics and, data and all of that stuff to actually make governance decisions in the city. Yeah. You don't need statistics and data to make governance decisions in the city. You just need certain aesthetic, modalities. Mm. You need this idea of a world-class city. You need this idea of, and on the name of these modalities, you can do anything. Mm. You can bring down a building. You can bring down, erase a slum. These doesn't need to happen on basis of any statistical, background like Foucault was thinking about it. And this turn again, I think all these three in some ways, and I think Stiegler actually has said it like the desire itself is technical. The desire itself has certain technical implements built into it. This exteriorization of desire already has certain technical dimension to it. I think these three things in some ways are linked, and I think it's coming in your work. How do you think of these three developments in that sense, and what is your feeling about that? Where are we going with these three things in that sense?
So there was some interference when you were asking the question. So did you say three? Did you say three things? Can you repeat really quickly what the three were?
This question of our politics becoming more and more smeared with jouissance. The second being these technological developments that we are seeing, artificial intelligence and so on and so forth, especially given the fact that our desire already is in some ways technical. I can maybe add to this question of repetition automatism that Lacan talks about, that, there's something monstrous or automatic or machine-like already in our signifying chain in that sense, which is getting achieved, with artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. And the third being aesthetic governmentality. Forms of governmentality which are not linked to statistics, data, and so on anymore, in that sense, but they are linked to certain imaginary, modules in that sense. These three things I think I see are emerging in our times, and I think all three are there in your work. Which is why I wanted to sort of raise it in that sense. And how are you looking at it? And, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Well. The smearing of jouissance, I mean, that's sort of everywhere, isn't it? Like we sort of are supposed to enjoy everything that we do, even going to a horrible job or filling out a form or whatever. Everything is supposed to be enjoyable, and it's supposed to be something that we relish. And of course, we are well aware of the fact that that's what we're being told all the time, but it doesn't make it any less difficult to avoid that's what's happening to us. We know very well about, etc., etc. I mean, on the Stiglerian front, yes, I definitely I'm convinced by the Stiglerian idea of this technicity and of memory, and the idea of exteriorization, and to really think about the long history of the technological being, and us as simply being technological creatures in ourselves, that there isn't a particular moment that we can say, oh, now we're involved in technology, and now we're digital beings, now it's all different. I don't think that at all. I think that this is a slow, long process that is part and parcel of the fact that we are beings in language, and beings who function through the abstraction of symbolic systems. It's just that, given that in the last few decades, there's been this particular sort of explosion of the ways that this seems to be harnessing certain forms of our knowledge and within our lifetimes, that we're noticing. But you could probably say the same thing about television, or about the invention of the printing press, or like about these particular moments that people within their lifetime went, oh my God, this is happening. But actually, who knows whether this is any more of a great big sort of historical jump. But we can't sort of know that at the moment. We can only sort of vaguely try and compare it to previous epochs. I think that the way that we are being administered is definitely aesthetic. It's definitely to do with the imaginary, to do with beauty, to do with invoking the supposed enjoyment of our bodies. But the paradox is, actually, we've never been so alienated from our bodies, and I'm not just in the sort of Marxian sense of our labor, etc., but literally alienated from the sort of immediacy of our body and how it functions, and the feeling of well-being, or whatever. I hate that word, but like, everywhere you go, there's somebody with an Instagram account telling you how to live well and well-being and eat well and la la la. And this is just a corollary to the fact that people are not their bodies. We're not our bodies. We are mediated through language. We are mediated through all of these other systems that we can only understand our bodies through. And unfortunately, I don't think there is no way to get back to that. And that's what psychoanalysis knows, is that there is no originary going back to this lovely time when we weren't castrated. But yet we still do need to be aware of the sort of the over kind of administration, in a sort of Marcusian sense, of how there is too much extraction of libido, and how to get back to some sort of level of slightly more immediacy, I suppose, if that gets at what you were sort of suggesting.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Isabel, there's a little bit of chat there about the book or the story you were referencing. Is there a title there that you could, The Poppling, is it called?
It's called The Poppling, but it's not available anywhere apart from in an anthology. I don't know if it's here on my desk.
It's I think the best find is Polysexuality by Silver
It's Polysexuality. I'm just seeing if it's around. I can show it to you. No, but it's Polysexuality, which is a semiotext anthology with loads of essays. It's really, really cool book, but it's hard to find, and it's
I think that the collective intelligence of our audience has found it, so just wanted to make sure that it was the right file.
Yeah, cool.
Objet Lil A, go for it. Stream God's Love on Spotify right now.
Don't do it. No, actually, we know what Aquinas said. He said that a woman is the image of God. And in the last few months of 2022, I was going through a rough period. Why? Because I wanted to know an answer to a very simple question, which is, what is feminine jouissance? So I read Darian Leader on it, Bruce Fink, Zizek, all the guys, Zupancic, Lacan. I still don't know what feminine jouissance is. I know what is being said about it, and that is, for example, that Alenka Zupancic in What is Sex says that we cannot say anything about it. So if you look at Zizek's thought, he actually kind of changes, because if you read like his stuff from like around the 2000s, he says feminine jouissance is kind of this enjoyment of latching on to like the masturbatory enjoyment of phallic jouissance. So that would be like, what is phallic jouissance? It's the jouissance of blah 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 blah. It's like, that's the jouissance of science, and it's the jouissance of the man. It's just blah blah blah. It's just this, just jacking off. So feminine jouissance is something completely different. And first Zizek says this. Then if you read Lacan's paper, or not paper, but seminar on feminine sexuality, he relates it to Hadewig van Antwerpen, who is a Christian mystic. And it kind of seems like he's pointing to some kind of beatitude, like a mystical vision of beatitude. Now, Zizek in Less Than Nothing actually completely rejects this notion of feminine jouissance. I don't remember exactly, because I'm tired, what exactly he says in Less Than Nothing, but it's also very strange. Now, as I still have to read more deeply, but as far as I'm concerned, like where Alenka Zupancic and Lorenzo Chiesa go with the problem, or for me, problem, I'm a man, after all, for all feminine jouissance, is that there is like a whole of feminine jouissance that we cannot say anything about it, but still the woman will actually say that she actually feels it. She will say that she feels it. And if you read the seminar on feminine sexuality, Lacan actually at a certain point has a mental breakdown. And he's very honest with it. He says he was on his knees asking these female psychoanalysts, please tell me, what is feminine jouissance? So you see, I really want to know the answer. So I wonder, like, even though we cannot say anything about it, Isabel, can you tell me or say what is feminine jouissance?
I think the laptop will just explode if I tell you. If I tell you, I have to kill you. I can't possibly. Well, yes. I mean, Lorenzo has his four versions of feminine jouissance that he articulates, and the phallic feminine, the étrange, and the what's the other one? There's the angel being, and then there's the strange jouissance. So he has the different all the different iterations that he goes through of how feminine jouissance relates to phallic jouissance and can be not assimilated to the hysteric, for example. So you get you can go through different, sort of identify different versions of it, like phallic feminine jouissance is that feeling of a woman wanting to be the one woman that satisfies the man, right? So it's me, you know, I can be that woman, I can be the one thing that you want. And that sort of latches onto this, the phallic, the sort of mirrors the phallic logic. And then you have this this strange position of not wanting to be the object, not wanting to be put in the position of you know, the hysteric woman, not wanting to be Dora, and refusing that, and constantly pushing that symbolic placement away. And then you have this other category that is something which is called non-sexual but real. And of course you say, well, what does that mean? And I think that whilst it's interesting to kind of go through all of these different iterations, what they're useful for is understanding Lacan, I suppose, but more accurately and carefully, and the ways to identify different iterations of feminine jouissance. But if I were to give my, you know, idea of what feminine jouissance would be succinctly, I would, I suppose, say it's to do with a specific logic. It's to do with trying to keep an open set when you're thinking about concepts. And that doesn't sound very much close to anything like enjoyment or pleasure or anything like that. But that's the only way that I can understand it, because I think if you try to reify it as an actual feeling or as an actual experience, you get into these sort of mystical ideas about like God and, you know, transcendence. And I think that those are quite difficult to put into words, because as soon as you put into words, then they become sort of theological. And I don't think that that's what Lacan wanted to do. And I think that this was part of his whole trick, is to get us into this position where we end up going, yeah, but what exactly is it? And then it always eludes us, so we can't quite articulate it. But hence why you have to resort to set theory, because it's the only way that you can reduce, you can remove all the imaginary elements of the problem, and all of the associations that you get with thinking about, for example, the God face or the ecstatic enjoyment of the statues of Bernini and stuff like that. How can you take all of those imaginary associations away from this quite sort of logical, formal idea to do with ontology? So I suppose then you end up just having Badiou, which is maybe not a very pleasurable or enjoyable image of feminine jouissance. But yeah, it's the best I'm going to give you at the moment.
You want to follow up to that, Dimitri?
Well, I'm still bewildered by the notion of feminine jouissance, and it's clear I'm going to have to be for the coming years. Yeah, this is ridiculous. This especially this notion of like, it's at once a non-sexual form of jouissance, and like apart from, you know, actually let's go back to Freud.
Mm-hmm.
Freud, of course, he started this whole he started rearing his ugly head, coming up with all these kinds of things, and he has a notion, everyone critiques it, also Lorenzo Chiesa. We don't talk about penis envy anymore. But for Freud, to put it in Lacanese, like clitoral, the clitoral orgasm is like phallic jouissance. Whereas for Freud, like to properly mature as a woman is to go beyond this and enjoy the properly feminine way of like, you know, vaginal orgasm or and so forth. There's multiple female orgasms. Now, people critique this. Lorenzo Chiesa critiques it because essentially he says that in saying this, you're imposing something on women.
Yeah.
Now, maybe, and just maybe, there is actually something to this notion developmentally. Yeah, I mean, I'm not so sure, like, if we have to throw out the notion of penis envy so quickly, as at least for someone like me who is still a student and still tarrying with all of this. So yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you that we have to get rid of like semblances and like imaginary associations of what feminine jouissance would be, and like this kind of deification of the woman or mother nature as the one who really enjoys. Yes, that's completely ridiculous. But then again, you come to the problem of what you said, you know, where yes, I get the logic of the non-all. It's not just like an exception to universality, but it's like it's just a series of exceptions themselves. So someone said in the chat, it's like a +1, +1, +1, but I think it's the exact opposite. It's like a -1, it's a -1, it's a -1. And maybe it's not even that, you know, because that's kind of a closed set in itself. Now, yeah, what are your thoughts about this? And maybe also in regards to penis envy and Freud himself?
Yeah, so I think this sort of association with the body is a little bit of a red herring, because if we reduce it to the experience of having a clitoris or the experience of being fucked or whatever that is supposedly feminine, okay, it's so phallic. I mean, it's so phallic. Obviously we can clearly see why that's not where feminine jouissance resides, and we can't put it there for obvious reasons, because then it immediately confuses the whole notion of homosexuality, for example. So I think one way to sort of approach this is to think about the sort of the paradox between, you know, the sort of not paradox, sorry, the dichotomy that's always placed between the biological, the immutability of biology versus discourse that is often trotted out, and of course at the moment trotted out a lot in trans debates, as if, you know, you've got this immutable X and XY, and then you've got discourse, which is gender, and that's da, da, da. But actually I think you should look at it the other way around and think about how the immutable stuff is the symbolic. The symbolic stuff is there, and it's there before we're born, and it's there after we die, and we merely get born into that with whatever anatomy that we have. And in a sense, you know, when you say what is feminine jouissance, well, I know it when I see it. You know, I know it when I see it. I know it when I know when I see phallic jouissance. I know when I see feminine jouissance. It doesn't always correspond to men or women. It doesn't always correspond to actual sexual activity or human bodies, but I am able to very much recognize it. And I think that that's experience that most people can probably share, to say, well, I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it, rather than, of course, you know, doing all of the Lacanian backflips with set theory and sets and ontology and stuff like that. So yeah, so the you know, the question of the phallus, of course, yes, the phallus is the impossible object of language that will forever be present, and positioning oneself towards that will indicate whether you are feminine or masculine. And it's definitely difficult to separate that always from the biological anatomical, but it still should be separated, I think.
All right,
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your answer.
God's love streaming on Spotify now. Alexander.
Hi, Isabel, thank you. Good to see you. It's been a while.
Yeah.
And as I already told you several times, but I will tell you again, I love listening to you and I love reading your work.
Thank you.
I'm happy that you just said that we shouldn't ontologize the notion of femininity and masculinity too much. We are not talking necessarily about men, empirically existing men versus empirically existing women. Those are positions within structures, indeed, as you just hinted upon. And the position that is taken up by a man is a position in which the jouissance always comes limited and fragmented. That's to say, castration. The notion of the feminine or the femininity, or that's to say the woman, that is to say that subject that is located on the right part, on the right side of the sexuation schema, those have the structural possibility, without saying that they are actualizing it, the structural possibility of having an experience that is both immediate and unmediated, that is to say beyond castration. But my question is another one. I'm not very well versed in contemporary postmodern philosophers like you are, Foucault, Deleuze. So perhaps my question is naive, and if that's the case, then just say so. How do you, you just said that you started out by saying that you are writing the book, and I'm wondering, how do you deal in your book, if at all, with the possibility of there being incommensurability between Lacan and the other French? I think here of the Lacanian subject, which is an effect of limit, lack, and loss, whereas for Foucault and Deleuze, they seem to deny this, right? But correct me if I'm wrong. That is to say, for Foucault, the subject is conceptualized in terms of power relations. When we talk about Deleuze, we are talking about multiplicity, right? Respectively. My problem, I don't know whether it's a problem, but my critical remark here would be that Lacan thinks singularity in a way that the other French don't have the capacity to do, seems to me, again. The word suffering, the Greek word is paschin, and means to suffer. So the patient is the one who suffers. And the question then becomes, suffers what? That's to say, suffers limit, lack, and loss. That is to say, it's an effect of castration. And it seems to me that this is, that the other French are bereft of the capacity to think that. And I also think here, Dimitri just referenced Less Than Nothing, Zizek's enormous book. And he's, in the introduction, he makes a reference to Guy Lardreau, French philosopher who's not a Lacanian, but who had a nickname for Lacan. And the name was Le Chasse Canaille, the scoundrel hunters. And that is to say, the Lacan as the one who goes against the Judith Butlers and the Derridas and the now you name them Lyotards, etc. So I wonder, how do you deal with this in this book, or not? And yeah, what's your take on this?
Yeah, well, what's my take on it? I mean, again, you know, as I said, I am invoking lots of thinkers that are not necessarily compatible and often are put at odds with each other. Obvious ones, Lacan and Foucault, obvious ones, Lacan and Deleuze, and you know, but yet they conflict over different concepts of subject or lack or desire or whatever, power, and that's fine. You know, I'm sort of aware of all of the kind of infighting and animosity around the stakes of these arguments, and I suppose I'm sort of, I don't care. No, what I mean is, I think there is more value in reading lots of different thinkers and trying to extract ideas and develop them further to come up with something different than always trying to sort of get the exact reading of this person's total oeuvre in relation to this person's total oeuvre. And let's not forget, you know, that's what Deleuze did, and that's what Lacan did. They both did that. You know, Lacan took lots of different ideas and tried to make sense of them and extract things to come up with something else. And Deleuze, you know, went around reading half bits of books and not finishing them, and you know, fucking everyone from behind, in his words. That's what he did. And in a sense, that method is a very productive one, because you don't have to stick to the kind of the very phallic logic, I think, of always trying to get it right. And I think that's quite a masculine trait, is to try and get the right reading, you know, to always get the right reading. I'm sure people would disagree with some of my readings of some things. I don't mind that, but I do think that it's useful to try and think new things when you're trying to deal with new problems. Try and think new situations. So that's how I'm dealing with it. But again, I don't think, because this book is not a sort of A, it's not finished, and B, it's not a kind of exhaustive system that tries to pin down exactly a template for how we must think of everything. Rather, it's a sort of heuristic, or whatever, however you would approach that, to try to ways to understand or explore or complicate. I think that's the key thing here, is the Baudrillard gesture is to make things more complicated. That's what philosophy should try to do, is always to complexify. And I suppose that's what I'm interested in, trying to complexify questions.
I'm not saying that your take on this is wrong. I'm just, there's this reason why I started by saying that I am not very well versed in postmodern thought, but I'm just wondering how the constitutive role of negativity in the thought of Lacan would be commensurable with those who actually dismiss this. Deleuze and Foucault, for example, is very critical of psychoanalysis. Says that it is a modern day form of confession, and that it reiterates power relation. Myself being quite a hardliner in Lacan, I reject that. I don't subscribe to that, but perhaps I should stay under the accusation of a phallic.
Yeah, but I think you can still hold that, you know, obviously I'm a Lacanian more than a Foucauldian, absolutely, but at the same time, they're different animals. I mean, you know, Lacan didn't do what Foucault did. He didn't look at epistemes. He didn't go through and sort of trying to identify shifts in thought. And I suppose what I'm interested in with Foucault is that element of it. And again, you know, it's not that this book is not a Foucauldian book, but it can't ignore the genealogy from which the kind of idea comes from, which is to try and use psychoanalysis in a way that thinks about shifts in cultural shifts and political and technological shifts, which is not really what often Lacanian psychoanalysis does, really. It deals with the one by one, which is what it should do.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
All right, thank you, Alexander. So we have two more questions, and then we'll wrap up. Ryan, you go first.
Hi. Always lovely to hear from you, Isabel. I don't know if I have this fully figured out, but I keep considering the relationships between Patipolitics and maybe cruel optimism, the Lauren Berlant consideration, especially in consideration of AI. AI as this sort of notion of both, as you said, like this machine that might create the ultimate orgasm, but also in this imaginary of it being also the apocalyptic, like bringer of the end of the world. I go back to your books opening with Rocco's Basilisk, where it's like this anxious attachment to the idea that you can create sort of this world-shattering moment. And maybe that's more about jouissance than it is cruel optimism exactly, but it feels like there's maybe a relationship between those. I don't know if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Thanks for that. The Rocco's Basilisk is a sort of emblem that I think carries on definitely into Patipolitics and gets at one of the sort of central ideas to do with, on the one hand, the perishability and fragility of the body, and on the other, the incessant repetition of the death drive and the potential to carry on and augment, and the sort of fear of whether that's something that's going to be possible, and what we're supposed to do with that is now more than ever on people's minds, I suppose, as they see that they're less and less able to kind of have dominion over their own body. So yeah, like how to kind of come to terms with the desire to reappropriate your body, and also sort of embrace all of the supposedly emancipatory potentials that we're told are going to come with all of these new ideas. It sort of makes me think of Membe's argument about the way that the suicide bomber tries to reappropriate death for themselves, because it's something that's been taken away from us, is our own death. We can't have any control over it, and whilst we're being told all the time that don't eat this, don't smoke that, don't drink this, this is the way to keep you alive, you're constantly trying to keep yourself alive, but alive for what? So you're just in this state of bare life, and you know, in that Agamben sense of just basically being a body that can keep going to work and can keep producing, but it's very much not a political being. It's very much a being divorced from any real stakes in the world. And I think one of the very sort of important and terrifying things about our current configuration is that whilst we're being told that everything is getting more efficient and more available for us and more potentials, the monopoly is becoming more and more centralized, and the control in the hands of fewer and fewer richer and richer people being able to dictate how our bodies are lived is definitely something that we need to get to grips with. And how we're going to combat that is a question I don't have the answer for, but it's something that I know that we need to worry about.
Any follow-up there? Okay, so if we have time, Sahil also raised his hand. If we just be to the point with these last questions so we can get to both. Philip?
I want to say I appreciate your complexifying things, and just like to go back to DJ Lil A's Penis Envy, you might check out Mari Rudy. She wrote a good one on that, but it'll probably even leave you more confused. My question is, I'm doing a play called Airness right now that's all about air guitar, and I'm trying to think about like how we can use our body to kind of dissolve this hard line between audience and participant. And so like the audience is coming on stage, they're going to have a chance to like kind of perform, but it feels sort of like an anti-alienation participatory exercise where like all you have is yourself. I'm just wondering if you have any ideas how that can be translated to politics, so people feel they're participating more with their bodies. And thanks for the talk. Very nice.
Thank you. Well, that's a very good question. And how to feel more participatory is a really important question, and one that relates back to this problem of emancipation. You know, what form does emancipation take? And unfortunately, the ways that we think we're emancipated are often not actually emancipatory at all. But again, it makes me think about the problem of language, and how to escape this fact that we can't really escape, but yet we glimpse moments of it. We glimpse moments of being in this sort of pre-linguistic state, which is an imaginary phantasmatic state, of course. But music is one of those places where it happens. And of course, sex as well, and fear and laughter, and these moments where you have bodily utterances which are not always already within the symbolic. Even though they're mediated through language and meaning, there is some sort of immediate connection to something that is an utterance from the body. And what's interesting to think about with psychoanalysis, of course, is the moment at which the spoken sound or word becomes locked into a signal, a symbol, and then is taken away from the immediacy of the body. And obviously you can think about how that happens with children, and that moment when screams become words and they stop standing in for something. Sorry, they begin to stand in for something that's not an immediate part of the body or demand of the body. And of course, that's not something that we can reappropriate. It's not something that we can get back to, but it's something that we glimpse through certain experiences that invoke our body. That's why we love watching comedy and films, scary films, and experiencing things that like feel make us be aware of the immediacy and sort of rawness of our physical embodiment. So I don't know how we would do that politically, but I know that music and the arts are extremely central to that, and are very important that we make sure that is some part of political programs always. And music used to be much more political than it is now. As we know, it used to be a very important tool of how we protest. And I think that's something that we've lost. So that's something definitely that needs to be brought back. Yeah.
All right, Sahil, you got the last question, sir. Good to see you.
Thanks, Carol. Hi, Isabel. Thank you for the talk. This is wonderful. My question, I might not be very clear with my question, but I'm going to try and keep it short. I'm just going back to the conversation that you had with Chetan about Stiegler and recognizing the technicity that humans entail, and also this continuity of technicity. And I was just wondering, when you were discussing augmentation, and when you're thinking about this relationship of enjoyment to augmenting ourselves and a constant repetitive or augmentation, where do we draw the line? Like, for example, when you were discussing this notion of faciality, there was a conversation about to what extent do we present the face. But we all present the face to some extent. I changed my t-shirt to switch on the camera. We all at some level are augmenting constantly. And so how do we then think of this relationship between enjoyment, which is in some senses becoming machinic, and this relationship of augmentation that we tend to exteriorize ourselves, that we tend to present, that there is enjoyment in that technical relation that we are drawing with the world. And so where is, I understand what you're asking about the Patipolitical turn, but what I'm not able to understand is, how do we then see this kind of positive augmentation? The very fact that faciality is crucial to be able to kind of engage with in a community, to also find, the positive side of this augmentative reality in some senses.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, this is a good question, and it's part of, I think, all of these types of books. You always kind of have this impulse, and also publishers always want you to do it as well, is to find the good parts and find the solution, and find a sort of resolution to some of the problems that are the heart of the book. And I mean, when it comes to faciality, yes, we can't escape the face, and we can't escape the tyranny of beauty, which is one dimension of faciality. But of course, beauty is only one element of it. There are many other dimensions to faciality, relating to race and gender and all the other ways that we divide ourselves up into different categories and hierarchies, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's not gonna, we're not going to escape that. And you know, Deleuze and Guattari talk about the probe head and the idea of escaping the face, and that this is what every human being should do, is to try and escape faciality, the tyranny of the face. How, you know, who knows? But they have this idea of the complete erasure, the sort of probe head, which I've likened to Kim Kardashian doing her Met Ball thing with the total black balaclava. And it's quite interesting because that Kim Kardashian, as the sort of arch figure of feminine perfectibility, doing this, making this gesture, is quite significant, I think. But I wonder, you know, what will be the next stage? I don't think we're going to be able to slow that element of it down. I think that the more we can tinker with ourselves at a sort of sort of pre-genetic level, that's going to happen. You know, we know that that's going to happen because we've already started that kind of thing a long time ago. So probably in the decades to come, it will become more about not just arguing over who gets to change their body to be what gender, what sex. It will be to do with, you know, augmenting or changing the race of your body, making yourself have various different traits and different, you know, all of the arguments over genetics and cloning and those kinds of problems, they're not going anywhere, unfortunately. And what the only defense we have is to keep people reading books, I suppose, is to keep people connected to some sort of notion of history, on some idea of criticality, because I think the danger at the moment is that we're so sort of obsessed with the future and of all the possibilities that we're told are what we should be doing and hurtling towards, that we lose any sort of context of what these things mean and where they came from and what the significance of these developments are.
No, I think that's helpful. I think that the whole return to slow thinking and finding a way to allow society to catch up to this augmentative reality. Yeah. No, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
I think that was a good way to recenter sort of where we started, Isabel, with the culture wars and the augmentation of the body really just getting started. I just wanted to say one thing before wrapping up, that I remember when I was 19, I was really impacted by Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near. And one of the things he says in the opening of the book is that the revolution of the singularity will happen in 3 major phases, what he calls GNR, which is genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics. And I just think, for me, at least as a frame of thinking, even since that book came out and reading it, is, you know, the potentialities of genetic engineering, redesigning the body on the genetic level, nanotechnology, redesigning on a almost like even an atomic level eventually, and then robotics, basically, you know, technologizing the body. I mean, these are going to be, however it unfolds, are going to constitute maybe the Patipolitical century if your word catches on, I think. And so I'm super interested in continuing to think through these problems, and it's been really interesting encountering your work. So I just really want to thank you for today.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Cadell, and thanks everyone for those questions, because it's been really helpful to me as well, and helping me to think as well. So thank you so much.
All right. So just before we close, I'll just give this is almost just for also the people watching on YouTube after, that the seminars for the Écrits is a series which Philosophy Portal's running throughout July. We've had Peter Rollins and Todd McGowan. Both of those seminars are available on my YouTube channel, and I'll share a link with everyone after this with a link to their presentations as well. Isabel's, if anyone's interested in watching the re-recording, this will go out on Sunday night. I usually do a little watch party. And next week, we're going to have Richard Boothby who's going to be talking about the concept of Das Ding. And I'm really interested in that because for Boothby, he seems to suggest that the concept of Das Ding has been overlooked in Lacanian theory. He says, the Bard subject, object Patier get a lot of attention, but Das Ding is something that he wants to focus on, and he sees it as important for actually the concepts of religion. He's thinking through ideas of religion and theology, and I think that he's pointing in an interesting direction. So if you're interested in attending that next week, you can register. Richard Boothby will be here with us. And like I said, all the previous recordings are there. Now, if you just go down here, this is all in preparation for the Ecrits course, which starts September 3rd. I'll be offering 13 lectures every Sunday in the fall, and we'll have all of the guest lecturers returning. Todd McGowan, Peter Rollins, Isabel Millar, and Richard Boothby will be continuing to develop these ideas, and who knows what will be the result of this ongoing work, but I really am anticipating a lot of interesting things to come out at the end. And part of the Philosophy Portal courses is not just teaching these, not just hosting seminars or offering lectures, but really encouraging creating your own work. Everything is pointing towards a conference and an anthology process where everyone will be able to engage in this and actually creatively contribute, I think, to a new literature inspired by the Ecrits. And also there'll be exegetical reading spaces hosted by Dimitri Croimans or Object Lillet. He's been here today. I just think that's also a really interesting space because Dimitri's been with Philosophy Portal for 2 years now. He's developing his own ideas, and I think having those spaces to go in on the gold nuggets of the Ecrits will be a really important opportunity. And also the discussion spaces in the course will be co-mediated with the Vanishing Mediators, Andrew Flores Big Sig, who is here today, and Nick Castellucci, who I don't think is able to come to these seminars, or he might be here, but he hasn't been able to participate yet. But I really think that will diversify the discussion space and try to open up a rich conversation space. So I guess the final point here is if you just go to the Ecrits course, on all seminar days, I'm offering a sale on the course. Course starts September 3rd. All the information there can be found on Philosophy Portal. And if you're interested in anything about the history of Philosophy Portal, we have conferences. We've held 3 conferences. We've published 2 anthologies as a result of our courses. And there's also ways to get involved. Every month we host Real Talk spaces. If you just go to the community tab, you'll see the Real Talk spaces. So that's my sort of PSA for Philosophy Portal there. And with that being said, I'll end the recording. And thank you so much, Isabel, for joining us today. And
Thank you
I'll
so
be
much.
in touch.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye, 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 bye.